Midnight in the cellar of Magnolia Heights Plantation. A woman stands in the darkness. Victoria Ashmore, 45 years old, blonde hair cascading down her shoulders, the jewel of Charleston society. In front of her, chained to the stone wall, lies a man. This man killed her husband. Just days ago, she had him whipped in the town square, beaten so severely that everyone believed he was dead. Blood pooled beneath him. His body went still, but Victoria had him brought here, to her plantation. She tended his wounds. She saved his life. And now, standing before this man who murdered the love of her life, Victoria Ashmore does something that would destroy her if society ever found out. She stands there, completely naked. And what happens next in that cellar will set off a chain of events so twisted, so dark, that it will end with a funeral, a wedding, and a lie that will fool an entire town. But this story didn't begin in that cellar. It began 6 weeks earlier, when Charleston's most respected family woke up to tragedy. Richard Ashmore was dead. His wife Victoria was devastated. She paid detectives a fortune. Find whoever killed my husband. And they did. But when the killer was captured, there was something in Victoria's eyes that no one noticed. A look that wasn't quite right. A look that suggested she had been planning something all along. Something that would reveal who Victoria Ashmore really was beneath the perfect facade, and something that would prove that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones everyone thinks they know. Let me tell you about Richard and Victoria Ashmore. If you lived in Charleston in 1863, you would have thought they were the perfect couple. Richard was 52, tall, distinguished, with silver hair and a warm smile that made everyone feel welcome. He donated to churches, supported Confederate soldiers' families, threw lavish parties where he'd toast to love and loyalty. Victoria, at 45, was still stunning. Golden hair, bright blue eyes, a laugh that could light up a room. They'd been married for 23 years. They had a beautiful daughter, Charlotte. Everyone said the Ashmores were blessed. But here's what you need to understand about perfect facades. They exist because something underneath needs hiding, and what was underneath the Ashmore marriage was so dark, so brutal, that Victoria learned to perfect her smile the same way soldiers learn to march, through pain, through repetition, through survival. And their 19-year-old daughter Charlotte? She knew everything. She'd been hearing the sounds through the walls since she was 7 years old. The thuds, the muffled crying, the way her mother would limp slightly the next morning, but still smile at breakfast. Charlotte had learned to pretend, just like her mother did, to be the perfect Southern belle while something cold and calculating grew inside her. But we'll come back to Charlotte later, because what she would eventually do would shock even those who thought they knew her. Richard Ashmore beat his wife, not in public, never where anyone could see. He was too smart for that, too controlled. But every night when they retired to their bedroom, when the servants were dismissed and the doors were locked, Richard would drink his bourbon and Victoria would prepare herself. He used his belt. He aimed for places that wouldn't show. Her back, her thighs, the soles of her feet. And when he was done beating her, he would force himself on her with the same casual cruelty a man might show breaking in a horse. Victoria learned not to cry. Crying made it worse. She learned to dissociate, to send her mind somewhere else while her body endured. She learned to wake up the next morning, cover the bruises with long sleeves and high collars, and smile at breakfast like nothing had happened. For 23 years she perfected this performance, and nobody knew, nobody suspected, because Richard was so charming in public and Victoria was so good at pretending. But here's what Richard didn't know about his wife, what nobody in Charleston suspected. All those years of abuse hadn't broken Victoria's spirit. They had compressed it, like coal under immense pressure, until something else began to form, something harder, something infinitely more dangerous. Victoria developed fantasies, not about escape, not about divorce, about violence, about revenge, about what it would feel like to watch her husband bleed. She never acted on these fantasies. She was trapped. In 1863, a woman couldn't simply leave her husband, especially not a wealthy, respected man like Richard. Divorce would mean scandal, poverty, losing her daughter. So Victoria stayed, and she waited, and the darkness inside her crystallized into something sharp enough to cut. Then came May 14th, 1863, The night everything shattered. 3 in the morning. Victoria woke to silence. That was the first strange thing. Richard always snored. Always. But the bed beside her was empty, the sheets cold. She found him in his study, slumped in his leather chair, a bullet hole in his chest. Blood everywhere. His eyes were still open, staring at nothing. Victoria should have screamed. She should have collapsed. That's what a devastated wife would do. But instead, she stood there for a long moment, looking at her husband's corpse. And she felt something she hadn't felt in 23 years. Relief. Pure, overwhelming relief. Then she started screaming. But not because she was sad. Because she knew she had to perform. The servants came running. The doctor was summoned. The sheriff arrived, and Victoria played her role perfectly. She wept. She trembled. She couldn't understand who would do this to her beloved Richard. The investigation revealed something interesting. The study window had been forced open from outside. Muddy footprints led from the garden to Richard's desk. The sheriff's theory, a robbery gone wrong. Richard must have confronted the intruder. But here's what didn't make sense. Nothing was stolen. Richard's gold watch was still in his pocket. His cash box was untouched, and the safe behind the painting was still locked. The sheriff ruled it a homicide by unknown assailant. Case closed. But Victoria wasn't satisfied with that. In fact, she became obsessed. She hired private detectives. She offered a reward of $5,000, a fortune, for information leading to the killer's capture. She visited the sheriff's office weekly, demanding updates, pleading for justice. Everyone in Charleston talked about how devoted she was. Poor Victoria, they said. She loved him so much she can't rest until his killer is found. They had no idea that Victoria's obsession had nothing to do with love. She needed to find the person who had given her this gift, the gift of freedom, because deep down she wanted to know why. Who had done this? And more importantly, what did they know about Richard's true nature? A bounty hunter named Silas Crawford came to Magnolia Heights with news. He'd tracked the killer. A runaway slave named Elijah Cross, 32 years old, known to be dangerous. Crawford had traced him to a hideout in the swamps outside Charleston. He'd be captured within days. When Crawford left, Victoria stood alone in her parlour. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. From anticipation. Something hungry was awakening inside her. Something that had been buried for 23 years under pain and submission. And now it was clawing its way to the surface. But what Victoria didn't know yet, what she wouldn't discover until much later, was that her daughter Charlotte had been in the hallway that night, listening. And Charlotte had smiled when she heard about the killer being found, because Charlotte had her own plans. Plans that would make her mother's obsession look tame by comparison. They brought Elijah Cross to Charleston in chains. Victoria watched from her carriage as the bounty hunters dragged him through the streets. He was exactly what you'd expect from a runaway slave who'd survived in the swamps. Filthy, scarred, dangerous-looking. His face had a long scar running from his left eye to his jaw. His hair was wild. His eyes were hard and cold. When people spat at him, he didn't flinch. When they called him monster, he didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead like he was already somewhere else. The sheriff wanted to hang him immediately. Open and shut case. But Victoria had other plans. She used her influence, her money, her status as the grieving widow. "I need to see justice done properly," she said. "I need to understand why he did this. I need to confront him first." The sheriff agreed to delay the execution for 1 week. But Victoria had a different kind of confrontation in mind. "The law says slaves who murder their masters must be whipped before execution," she told the sheriff. "I want that punishment carried out. In the town square. I want everyone to see what happens to those who destroy families." On June 7th, 1863, the entire town of Charleston gathered in the square to watch Elijah Cross receive 50 lashes. They tied him to the whipping post, stripped his shirt, and Victoria herself gave the order. "Begin." The town's strongest man, a blacksmith named Thomas, wielded the whip. Crack! The first lash opened Elijah's back. Crack! The second drew blood. By the 10th lash, his back was shredded. By the 20th, he'd stopped making sounds. By the 30th, his legs gave out, and only the ropes held him up. By the 40th, people in the crowd were turning away, saying this was too much, even for a murderer. By the 50th lash, Elijah Cross hung motionless against the post, blood pooling beneath him, his breathing so shallow it was barely visible. "He's dead," someone in the crowd whispered. The blacksmith checked for a pulse. "Sorry, I can't repeat that text. It contains explicit non-consensual sexual content, which I'm not allowed to reproduce even if it was provided by you. If you'd like, I can help by giving a neutral summary, discussing themes, or assisting in another way that avoids graphic or sexual detail." She wouldn't speak, wouldn't explain. She would just take what she wanted and leave. Victoria started adding something new to Elijah's food. An herbal tincture that she'd learned about from a travelling doctor years ago, an aphrodisiac derived from certain plants found in South America. It had potent effects. It increased stamina, intensified sensation, made multiple encounters in one night possible. Elijah realized what was happening when he started feeling changes in his body. Victoria was drugging him, controlling his physical responses, turning his body into an instrument for her pleasure. And there was nothing he could do about it. He was completely at her mercy. But here's what neither of them knew. Every night, when Victoria descended to that cellar, there was someone else awake in Magnolia Heights. Someone watching from her bedroom window as the lamplight flickered in the cellar entrance. Someone whose curiosity was growing into something far more dangerous than either Victoria or Elijah could have imagined. Victoria finally spoke to Elijah. It was late at night, after one of their encounters. She sat on the floor beside him, still breathing hard, and she said, "Do you know why I'm keeping you alive?" Elijah didn't answer. He'd learned that Victoria preferred silence. "Because you killed Richard," she continued. "My perfect, charming, wonderful husband who everyone loved, and I want you to know what he really was." And then Victoria told Elijah everything. About the 23 years of abuse, the beatings, the rape, the way Richard had systematically broken her down while maintaining his perfect public image. She spoke in a flat, emotionless tone like she was reading a legal document, but Elijah could hear the ocean of rage beneath those words, rage so deep and old that it had calcified into something cold and immovable. "When I heard he was dead, I felt nothing but relief," Victoria said. "And when I found out you killed him, I didn't want revenge. I wanted to reward you. But I couldn't do that publicly, so I brought you here. And I'm giving you what I never gave him willingly. My choice, my desire, my control." Elijah processed this revelation carefully. This wasn't about him at all. He was just a tool Victoria was using to reclaim something that had been stolen from her. Her autonomy, her sexuality, her power. He was the vehicle for her healing, twisted as it was. "So you see," Victoria continued, standing up and adjusting her dress, "you're not my prisoner. You're my salvation. And I'm going to keep you here as long as I need you." She left, and Elijah lay there in the darkness, understanding Victoria now. And understanding her gave him something crucial. Leverage. Because damaged people, traumatized people, they have patterns, weaknesses, things they need desperately. And if Elijah could figure out what Victoria needed, he could use that to survive. Maybe even to escape. But what Elijah didn't know, what would only become clear weeks later, was that someone else had been listening to every word Victoria said that night. Someone who had discovered a way to hear everything that happened in that cellar. Someone who was about to insert herself into this twisted arrangement in ways that would make everything infinitely more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. Charlotte Ashmore had found the ventilation grate. Charlotte Ashmore was beautiful in the way that porcelain dolls are beautiful. Fragile-looking but hard underneath, pale blonde hair that fell to her waist like silk. Skin so pale it seemed translucent, blue eyes that seemed innocent but held calculation. She looked like an angel. But Charlotte had learned from the best how to hide cruelty beneath beauty. She'd known about her father's abuse, not because Victoria told her, because Charlotte had heard it through the walls of Magnolia Heights since she was 7 years old. The thuds, the muffled cries, the sounds that made her pull her pillow over her head and pretend she was somewhere else. She'd grown up knowing that her charming, loving father was a monster, and she'd grown up watching her mother pretend everything was fine. Charlotte learned to do the same thing, to smile and curtsy and play the perfect Southern belle while something cold and calculating festered inside her. And when her father died, Charlotte's first thought wasn't grief. It was, finally. But then her mother started acting strange, disappearing for hours every night, locking herself in parts of the house that were supposed to be unused. And Charlotte was curious, because Charlotte had inherited traits from both her parents, her father's capacity for cruelty and her mother's talent for hiding it. Charlotte had been investigating. She'd found the ventilation grate in the unused storage room above the cellar, the grate that carried sound perfectly from the cellar below. She'd heard everything. Her mother's visits, the sounds of their encounters, Victoria's confession about the years of abuse, and most importantly, she'd heard Elijah's voice, deep, careful, intelligent. One night, after Victoria had left the cellar and returned to her room, Charlotte found the spare key. She'd watched where her mother hid it. And late that night, when the house was silent, Charlotte descended the stairs and unlocked the door. Elijah was chained to the wall, bare-chested, his back still showing the fading marks from the whipping. When he saw Charlotte enter, he tensed. Thought maybe Victoria had sent someone to finally kill him. But Charlotte just stood there, staring at him with those innocent blue eyes that weren't innocent at all. "So you're the one," she said softly. "You're the one who killed my father." Elijah didn't respond, didn't know how to respond. Charlotte walked closer. She was wearing a white nightgown, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders. She looked like a ghost in the candlelight. "Do you know what he was?" she asked. "My father?" Still, Elijah said nothing. "He was a monster," Charlotte continued. "I heard what he did to my mother, every night for years. I heard her crying. I heard the sounds of him hurting her, and I did nothing. She was close enough now that Elijah could see tears forming in her eyes. But you did something. You stopped him. And for that, I want to thank you." Then Charlotte did something that would change everything. She reached out and touched Elijah's face, gently, almost reverently. "My mother thinks she's the only one who gets to keep you," she whispered, "but she's wrong." And that's when Elijah grasped the full horror of his situation. Mother and daughter were both damaged, both twisted by Richard's abuse in different ways, and now they were both fixating on him as a way to work through their trauma. This was far worse than he'd thought. But Elijah was a survivor. He'd survived slavery, survived escaping, survived the swamps, survived the whipping, and he would survive this. By playing along, by giving both women what they needed, and by carefully, patiently manipulating the situation to his advantage. "Your mother saved my life," Elijah said carefully, first words he'd spoken to Charlotte. "And I'm grateful, but she doesn't talk to me, doesn't explain anything. I don't even know why she's keeping me alive." Charlotte smiled. It was a sad, broken smile. "Because you freed her, and now she's trying to figure out what to do with her freedom." She paused. "But I can help you understand her. I know things she doesn't think I know." Over the next hour, Charlotte told Elijah everything. About growing up in Magnolia Heights, about Richard's public persona versus his private cruelty. About Victoria's slow transformation from a vibrant young woman into a shell of herself. About Charlotte's own confusion and anger and the cold calculation that had grown inside her. And Elijah listened, and he calculated. Because Charlotte was young, naive in some ways despite her trauma. She was starving for someone to confide in, someone who understood the darkness. "Sorry, I can't provide that. The passage contains explicit sexual violence, and I can't reproduce it. If you'd like a summary that removes graphic or sexual content, I can do that." He revealed enough to make Charlotte feel like he was being honest, but not so much that it would cause immediate conflict. "She doesn't talk much," he'd say. "She's working through something. Pain, I think." Charlotte would nod knowingly. "She's kept everything inside for so long. I used to think she was weak for not fighting back against father, but now I wonder if maybe she was stronger than any of us, to survive that and still function." These conversations bonded them. Charlotte started visiting more frequently, and her touches became bolder. One night Charlotte kissed him, just a brief kiss, testing, and when Elijah didn't pull away, didn't reject her, Charlotte's eyes lit up with something dangerous, hope mixed with obsession. "Do you think about me?" she asked. "When Mother is here, do you think about me instead?" Elijah knew he was standing on the edge of a cliff. The wrong answer could destroy everything. "I think about freedom." he said carefully, "and I think about the two people who hold my life in their hands." It was the perfect answer. Honest enough to seem genuine, ambiguous enough to let Charlotte interpret it however she wanted. And Charlotte interpreted it as secret affection. She started believing that Elijah had feelings for her, that he was only tolerating her mother's visits but truly wanted Charlotte. This delusion grew stronger over the following weeks. Charlotte's visits became longer, more intimate, and one night, emboldened by her fantasies and her desperate need to have something that was hers alone, Charlotte seduced Elijah. Elijah could have refused, should have refused, but he grasped that refusing would end his leverage over Charlotte, would maybe even turn her against him. So he gave Charlotte what she wanted, and he hated himself for it, because he knew he was manipulating a damaged 19-year-old girl who didn't fully understand what she was doing. But survival sometimes requires terrible choices, and Elijah had learned that lesson long before he ended up in Victoria's cellar. What neither Elijah nor Charlotte realized in that moment was that Victoria had returned to the cellar early that night, had heard sounds through the door, had stood in the hallway, listening, knowing. And something inside Victoria had cracked, not with rage, with something far colder, with calculation, because Victoria had just discovered that her daughter was a threat, and Victoria had learned long ago how to eliminate threats. Richard had taught her that lesson every night for 23 years. Something shifted. Victoria had unchained Elijah completely. He was no longer bound to the wall. He could move freely around the cellar, though the door was still locked. Victoria trusted him not to try to escape, or maybe she just didn't care anymore, because Victoria was transforming. The cold, controlled woman was becoming someone else, someone softer, someone dangerously attached. One night, after one of their encounters, Victoria lay beside Elijah on the cellar floor and said something she'd never said before. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." Elijah turned to look at her. Her guard was down. She looked vulnerable, lost. "I brought you here to feel powerful," Victoria continued, "to take control of something. But now I feel." She trailed off, unable to articulate it. "Dependent," Elijah finished for her. "You feel dependent on this, on me." Victoria nodded slowly. "I should kill you. I should end this before it becomes something I can't control. But I can't. I don't want to." This was the moment Elijah had been waiting for. The moment when Victoria's walls had crumbled enough for real manipulation to work. "Then don't," he said softly. "Unchain me properly. Let me move around. I'm not going to run, Victoria. Where would I go? I'm a runaway slave who supposedly died in the town square. I have no life outside this cellar. You're all I have." It was perfectly calculated. He'd used her first name for the first time. He'd positioned himself as helpless, harmless, dependent on her. He'd appealed to her need for control, while also making her feel safe. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow I'll move you to the east wing. There's a room there, empty, with a bed and windows. Nobody goes there. You can stay there, but you can never leave that room when anyone else is in the house. Only at night, only when I give permission." Elijah's heart raced. This was progress, real progress toward freedom. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it, even though everything about this situation was twisted and wrong. But what neither Elijah nor Victoria knew was that Charlotte had been listening. She'd developed a habit of spying on her mother's visits, pressing her ear to the cellar door, trying to understand what was happening between her mother and the man Charlotte was falling in love with. And what Charlotte heard that night shattered her. Her mother was moving Elijah, giving him better quarters. They were becoming closer. And worst of all, Elijah had sounded genuinely grateful, genuinely affectionate toward Victoria. Charlotte felt something she'd never felt before. Betrayal, because she'd convinced herself that Elijah was hers, that the intimacy they'd shared meant something special. But now she realized the truth. Elijah was playing both of them, using both of them, and Charlotte's love started to curdle into something much darker. Charlotte confronted Elijah before her mother could move him. She stormed into the cellar, eyes blazing. "You lied to me," she hissed. Elijah's expression remained calm. "I never lied to you, Charlotte. You made me think." She stopped, unable to say it out loud. "I made you think what? That I cared about you? I do care about you. You're the only person in this house who treats me like a human being instead of a possession. But you're sleeping with my mother. Your mother keeps me here against my will, Elijah said, his voice hard now. I don't have choices, Charlotte. I do what I have to do to survive. Just like you did when your father was alive. You played the perfect daughter even though you hated him. Is that so different? Charlotte's anger faltered. Because he was right. She had played a role for years, had hidden her true feelings to survive. How could she judge Elijah for doing the same? I'm sorry, she whispered. I thought maybe we could... Could what? Run away together? Elijah stood up, moved closer to her. Charlotte, look at me. Really look at me. I'm a runaway slave, your mother's prisoner. What kind of future could we possibly have? Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. But then something hardened in them. Something cold and final. We could have a future if my mother wasn't in the way. Elijah went very still, because he recognized that look, that tone. He'd miscalculated catastrophically. Charlotte wasn't just naive and damaged, she was becoming something lethal. What are you suggesting? He asked carefully. Charlotte's smile was chilling. Mother has been acting strange ever since father died. What if she had an accident? A tragic accident? She's been so distraught, so mentally unstable. It wouldn't be surprising if something happened to her. Charlotte, that's... murder? Charlotte laughed, but it was a broken sound. You murdered my father. Mother is keeping you as her pet. This whole house is built on lies and violence. One more death won't change anything. It'll just simplify things. Elijah realized in that moment how catastrophically he'd failed. By manipulating both women, by trying to play them against each other, he'd created a monster. Charlotte had learned from her father how to hide cruelty. She'd learned from her mother how to justify violence, and she'd learned from Elijah how to manipulate. And now she'd combined all those lessons into something deadly. I'm not helping you kill your mother, Elijah said firmly. Charlotte's smile widened. You don't have to help. You just have to not stop me. And in return, I'll give you what you really want. Freedom, a new identity, a new life. We'll leave Charleston together. Go north. I have money. We can disappear. And if I refuse, then I tell everyone that my mother has been keeping you prisoner, that she's been lying about your death, that she's been... Charlotte's voice dropped to a whisper. Having relations with you. Mother will hang for that, and so will you once they realize you're still alive. Neither of you will survive the scandal. Checkmate. Charlotte had him cornered, and Elijah grasped with sinking dread that he'd created this situation. By trying to survive, by playing both women, he'd set Charlotte on a path toward matricide, and now he was complicit. Either he helped her, or he condemned both himself and Victoria to exposure and death. Give me time to think, he said finally. Charlotte nodded. You have until tomorrow night. That's when Mother is planning to move you. That's when we'll act. She turned to leave, then paused. I loved you, you know. I really did. But now I understand. Love is just another kind of chain, and I'm tired of wearing chains. When she was gone, Elijah sat in the darkness and faced the truth. He was no longer manipulating this situation. The situation was manipulating him. And he couldn't see any way out that didn't end with blood. But here's what Elijah didn't know. What nobody in Magnolia Heights knew. Victoria had heard every word of Charlotte's threat. Because Victoria hadn't gone to bed that night, she'd been standing in the hallway, listening. And now Victoria Ashmore, who had survived 23 years of abuse, who had learned to be patient and cold and calculating, was planning something that would change everything. Because Victoria had learned one crucial lesson from her husband, strike first. Victoria came to the cellar as planned. She was in a good mood, smiling, carrying a set of clothes for Elijah. I've prepared the room, she said. It's small but comfortable. You'll like it. Elijah watched her, guilt gnawing at his conscience, because he knew what was about to happen. Charlotte had explained her plan that afternoon during a brief visit. Poison. Slow-acting, impossible to detect. She'd slip it into Victoria's evening tea. Victoria would go to sleep and simply never wake up. Peaceful. Clean. No violence. No mess. Are you all right? Victoria asked, noticing his expression. You seem distracted. Elijah opened his mouth. This was the moment. He could warn Victoria, could tell her what Charlotte was planning, could stop this before it went too far. But then he thought about what would happen if he did. Victoria would confront Charlotte. Charlotte would expose everything. Both women would be destroyed. And Elijah would die anyway, either hanged as a murderer or killed by someone seeking to cover up the scandal. So Elijah said nothing. He just nodded. "I'm fine. Just nervous about the change." Victoria smiled and touched his face. "Don't be nervous. I'll take care of you. I always will." Those words haunted Elijah as Victoria left the cellar that night. He heard her footsteps ascending the stairs, heard the door to the main house open and close, and he knew that somewhere up there, Charlotte was preparing the poisoned tea. But what Elijah didn't know, what nobody in that house knew except Victoria herself, was that Victoria had no intention of drinking that tea. Because Victoria had been planning her own move, her own checkmate, and it would change everything. Elijah didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. He lay in the darkness and waited. Around 3 a.m, he heard footsteps on the cellar stairs. Quick, light footsteps. Charlotte. She burst through the door, breathless, her eyes wild with a mixture of excitement and terror. "It's done," she whispered. "She drank it." All of it. Elijah felt sick. How long? "The poison takes about 6 hours. She'll go to sleep normally. Her heart will just stop. The doctor will think it's natural, grief-induced heart failure. No one will question it." Charlotte was shaking, adrenaline coursing through her. She grabbed Elijah's hands. "We're free, both of us. We're finally free." But Elijah didn't feel free. He felt like he'd just sealed his own damnation, like he'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "Come with me," Charlotte said. "I want you to see something." She led him up the cellar stairs. The first time Elijah had left the cellar in 3 months. His legs were weak, unsteady. The house was dark, silent. Charlotte led him to her mother's bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. "Look," Charlotte whispered. Elijah looked inside. Victoria was in bed, apparently sleeping peacefully. Her blonde hair spread across the pillow, her breathing slow and steady. She looked at peace. For the first time since Elijah had met her, Victoria looked genuinely at peace. "In a few hours, she'll just stop," Charlotte whispered. "And then it's over. Everything is over. We can finally start living." They stood there for a long moment, watching Victoria sleep. Neither of them noticed the slight smile on Victoria's face. Neither of them saw her eyes flutter open for just a moment, looking directly at them before closing again. Neither of them realized that Victoria was fully awake, fully aware, and waiting. Victoria Ashmore died at dawn. The servants found her in her bed, peaceful, as if she'd simply fallen asleep and forgotten to wake up. Dr. Morrison examined the body and declared it natural causes. Her heart gave out, he said solemnly. The stress of losing her husband, the strain of these past months, it was too much for her. Charlotte played her part perfectly. She wept, she collapsed. She allowed the town's women to comfort her, to tell her how brave she was, how strong. First father, now mother, they said. Poor Charlotte, orphaned at 19. The funeral was small, tasteful. Charleston mourned the loss of Victoria Ashmore, beloved wife, devoted mother, pillar of the community. Nobody suspected anything. Why would they? Victoria had seemed fine, a bit withdrawn perhaps, but that was expected given her grief. These things happened. Hearts gave out. Life was fragile. After the funeral, Charlotte made her move. She told the servants that she needed time alone to grieve, that she'd be spending several weeks in seclusion. They understood. They packed their things and went to stay with relatives, leaving Magnolia Heights empty except for Charlotte and the man hidden in the cellar. Elijah expected Charlotte to let him go immediately. That had been the deal. But Charlotte had other plans. "We can't just disappear right away," she explained that night. "People would talk, would get suspicious. We need to wait a few months, let things settle. And we need to transform you." "Transform me?" "You can't be Elijah Cross anymore. That man is dead, remember? You died in the town square, so we need to make you into someone else. Someone who could feasibly be my husband." Charlotte orchestrated an elaborate transformation. She cut Elijah's hair, styled it properly. She had him shaved daily. She got rid of his scars using expensive creams and makeup techniques. She taught him how to speak like a gentleman, how to carry himself like someone educated. She provided him with books, tutored him in literature and history and social graces. And slowly Elijah Cross disappeared. In his place emerged Edward Fairfax, a wealthy merchant from Richmond who'd lost his family in the war. Charlotte had forged documents, created an entire false history. Edward was a widower, grief-stricken, who'd come to Charleston seeking a fresh start. The transformation wasn't just physical. Elijah found himself actually becoming Edward. He'd been playing roles for so long, manipulating people, wearing masks, that putting on a new identity felt almost natural. Sometimes he'd look in the mirror and not recognize himself. Sometimes he'd forget that Edward wasn't real. During this time, something strange happened between Charlotte and Elijah. They lived alone in Magnolia Heights, working together on his transformation, and they developed a kind of intimacy. Not love, exactly. More like the bond between co-conspirators, between two people who'd committed murder together and were now bound by shared guilt and shared secrets. Charlotte confessed to Elijah one night that she didn't feel guilty about killing her mother. She was broken, Charlotte said, damaged beyond repair. I gave her peace, and I gave us a chance at something better. Elijah wondered if Charlotte really believed that, or if she was just trying to convince herself. But he didn't challenge her, because he was complicit. He'd let Victoria die when he could have saved her. His silence had killed her just as much as Charlotte's poison. Charlotte began introducing Edward Fairfax to Charleston society. She'd met him through correspondence, she explained. He was looking to invest in South Carolina plantations. They'd struck up a friendship through letters. And now he'd come to visit. The town's reaction was mixed. Some people thought it was too soon after Victoria's death for Charlotte to be entertaining male visitors. But others pointed out that Charlotte was 19, alone, vulnerable. She needed a husband, and Edward seemed respectable, wealthy, appropriate. Over the next 2 months, Charlotte and Edward conducted a very public courtship. They attended church together. They took walks through Charleston. They had dinner at the homes of influential families. And slowly, people began to accept them as a couple. The scandal faded. The timing seemed less suspicious. Edward was charming, educated. He spoke knowledgeably about business and literature. He was attentive to Charlotte, but not inappropriately so. He won over the town's patriarchs with his business acumen and the matrons with his gentlemanly manners. Nobody suspected that beneath Edward Fairfax's polished exterior was Elijah Cross, the runaway slave who'd murdered Richard Ashmore. The transformation was so complete, so convincing, that sometimes even Elijah forgot who he really was. On a bright morning, Charlotte Ashmore married Edward Fairfax in Charleston's historic St. Michael's Church. The ceremony was beautiful. Charlotte wore white lace, her blonde hair crowned with orange blossoms. Edward wore a perfectly tailored suit. They spoke their vows with steady voices. When the Reverend said, "I now pronounce you man and wife," the congregation applauded. Nobody noticed the slight tremor in Edward's hands. Nobody saw the flash of something unreadable in Charlotte's eyes. They saw only what they wanted to see, a happy ending. A young woman finding love after tragedy, a new beginning for Magnolia Heights. But there were no happy endings in this story. Only different kinds of imprisonment. Only new chains replacing old ones. Charlotte and Edward returned to Magnolia Heights as husband and wife. Charlotte was now one of Charleston's wealthiest young women, owner of a profitable plantation, wife to a successful merchant. She'd achieved everything she'd wanted. But achievement didn't bring peace. At night, alone in the master bedroom that had once been her mother's, Charlotte would wake up screaming. She'd dream about Victoria's face in those final moments, about the moment her mother drank the poisoned tea, about her father's violence, her mother's suffering, the cellar where Elijah had been kept. All the trauma she'd compartmentalized, all the horror she'd justified, was surfacing in nightmares she couldn't control. Edward, sleeping beside her, would wake to comfort her, but his comfort was hollow, because Edward hated Charlotte with a cold, bitter hatred that grew stronger each day. Not openly, not obviously, but in the quiet moments when she wasn't looking, his expression would shift to something cold and contemptuous. He'd played the devoted suitor, the loving husband, but it was all performance, and now he was trapped in this performance forever, because Edward grasped something Charlotte didn't fully grasp yet. They could never leave each other. They were bound together by murder and lies and secrets that would destroy them both if exposed. Edward couldn't abandon Charlotte without risking her confessing everything. Charlotte couldn't expose Edward without condemning herself. They were locked together in a prison of their own making. The cellar had simply expanded to encompass their entire lives. The plantation thrived under Edward's management. He was good at business, good at managing workers, good at presenting the image of a successful gentleman farmer. Charleston society accepted him completely. Within a year of the marriage, people had forgotten to think of him as an outsider. He was simply Mr. Fairfax, Charlotte's devoted husband, a pillar of the community. But the cost of this success was staggering. Edward had to watch the plantation's enslaved workers and pretend he wasn't one of them. Had to enforce the same brutal system that had destroyed his own family. Had to become the thing he'd hated most in order to maintain his disguise. And every day something inside him died a little more. Charlotte, meanwhile, was transforming into her mother. The realization hit her one morning when she was looking in her vanity mirror and saw Victoria's expression staring back at her. The same haunted eyes, the same forced smile, the same exhaustion from maintaining a facade 24 hours a day. She'd killed her mother to escape her mother's fate, only to become her anyway. The cruelest irony of all. The intimacy they'd shared while planning Victoria's murder evaporated like morning mist. Charlotte and Edward became strangers sharing a house. They spoke politely at dinner. They maintained appearances in public. They slept in the same bed, but might as well have been in different states. But in private, they barely acknowledged each other. Their marriage was a business arrangement built on mutual blackmail and shared guilt. Charlotte discovered she was pregnant. The news should have been joyous. A new generation, a fresh start, hope for the future. But instead, both she and Edward felt something closer to horror. Because bringing a child into this marriage, into this elaborate lie, felt like creating another victim. Like extending the curse to an innocent soul who had no choice in the matter. But Charlotte couldn't abort. Not in 1867 Charleston. Not as the respectable Mrs. Fairfax. So the pregnancy progressed, and as Charlotte's belly swelled, so did her dread. She'd wake at night, feeling the baby move and think, what kind of monster am I bringing into this world? What kind of mother can I be when I murdered my own mother? When their daughter was born in January 1868, Charlotte named her Victoria. Edward didn't object, though the name felt like a curse, a constant reminder of what they'd done. Baby Victoria was beautiful, with blonde hair and blue eyes like her mother and grandmother. Perfect, innocent, untouched by the darkness that had consumed 3 generations. Edward held his daughter and felt something break inside him, something fundamental and irreparable. He'd survived slavery, survived the swamps, survived the whipping, survived 3 years of pretending to be someone else. But looking at this innocent child who would grow up never knowing the truth about her parents, about herself, about the blood that had been spilled to create the illusion of her perfect family, he realized he couldn't do this anymore. He told Charlotte that night that he was going to confess, going to turn himself in, tell the authorities everything, end this nightmare before it consumed their daughter too. Charlotte's response was cold and practical, emotionless. She'd become her mother completely. If you do that, they'll hang you, and they'll take Victoria away from me, probably send her to an orphanage or some distant relative who'll raise her in poverty and shame. Is that what you want? To destroy this child's life before it's even begun? Edward had no answer, because she was right. Confessing wouldn't fix anything. It would just create more victims, more suffering, more broken lives. The cycle would continue. So he stayed, and the years passed, and Edward Fairfax became more real, while Elijah Cross faded to a ghost, then to a shadow, then to nothing at all. Sometimes Edward would forget that he'd ever been anyone else. Sometimes he'd look at his reflection and not recognize the man staring back. He'd become the mask. The mask had consumed him. Charlotte aged into a replica of her mother. By the time she was 35, she had the same exhausted elegance, the same careful control, the same haunted eyes that never quite looked at anything directly. She raised Victoria with love but also with distance, as if she was afraid to get too close to her own daughter. As if she knew that love in this family was cursed, that everyone who loved or was loved in Magnolia Heights ended up destroyed. Victoria grew up believing her family was normal, happy, blessed. She knew nothing of the cellar, nothing of Elijah Cross, nothing of the murders and lies that had created her perfect world. She was sweet, kind, sheltered. Everything Charlotte had pretended to be at that age but never actually was. Edward and Charlotte grew old together, trapped in their lie, until death finally released them. Edward died first in 1892 at age 61. A heart attack, the doctors said, but really it was exhaustion. 40 years of pretending to be someone else had simply worn him out. Charlotte followed 6 months later. Some said it was grief, but really, she'd just been waiting for permission to finally stop performing, to finally lay down the mask she'd worn for so long it had fused to her face. The truth about what happened at Magnolia Heights remained buried for decades. Charlotte and Edward took their secrets to the grave. Victoria, the daughter, grew up, married a respectable Charleston lawyer, had children of her own, and died in 1935 at age 67, never knowing that her father was born a slave or that her mother murdered her grandmother. The lies were perfect, complete, impenetrable. When Magnolia Heights was being renovated after decades of neglect, workers discovered something hidden behind a false wall in the east wing. The room Edward had lived in during those final months before Victoria's murder. A metal box, carefully sealed, untouched for over 80 years. Inside was a journal, Victoria's journal. The original Victoria, Charlotte's mother, the woman who'd been murdered in her sleep, written during those final 4 months of her life. The journal detailed everything with clinical precision. The years of abuse from Richard, the murder that she'd been grateful for, her imprisonment of Elijah, her descent into obsession and addiction, her transformation from victim into abuser, and most damningly her growing suspicion that Charlotte and Elijah were conducting their own relationship behind her back. But it was the final entry that made the blood run cold for everyone who read it, dated the night before Victoria died, written in shaky handwriting that suggested the writer knew exactly what was coming. I know what they're planning. I can see it in Charlotte's eyes when she looks at me now. She looks at me the way Richard used to look at me before he'd strike. That same cold calculation, that same certainty that I deserve what's coming. I should stop them, should send Elijah away, should confront Charlotte. But I'm so tired, so very tired of fighting, of surviving, of pretending. Maybe it's better this way. Maybe they deserve each other. Maybe this is my punishment for what I've become. For what I did to Elijah. For turning into the same kind of monster that Richard was, just wearing a different face. I think I'll drink the tea tomorrow night. I'll know it's poisoned, but I'll drink it anyway, because at least that way, the choice is mine. At least that way, I end this on my own terms. Let them have their victory. Let them build their life on my corpse. Let them discover what I already know, that some prisons can't be escaped, even by those who hold the keys. Victoria had known. She'd known and chosen not to fight. Chosen to drink the poisoned tea. Chosen to end her own suffering and let Charlotte and Elijah live with the guilt. It wasn't murder, not exactly. It was assisted suicide. Victoria had been complicit in her own death. The discovery of the journal caused an earthquake that rocked Charleston society. The Fairfax family, descended from Edward and Charlotte, tried desperately to suppress it. They offered money, they threatened lawsuits, they used every bit of influence they had. But the story leaked anyway. Newspapers published excerpts, historians demanded access. The truth, so carefully buried for 84 years, exploded into public consciousness. Some saw Victoria as a victim who'd been driven to madness by abuse and trauma. Others saw her as a monster who'd kept a man prisoner and assaulted him repeatedly. Some saw Charlotte as a murderer who'd killed her own mother. Others saw her as a desperate girl trying to escape a cycle of violence the only way she knew how. And Elijah? Some saw him as a freedom fighter who'd killed a brutal plantation owner, others as a manipulator who'd played two damaged women against each other, still others as just another victim of a system designed to destroy people systematically and completely. The truth was probably that they were all of these things simultaneously, victims and monsters, survivors and destroyers, human beings forced into impossible situations by a society built on inequality and violence, making terrible choices that created more victims and more monsters in an endless, grinding cycle. So what do you think about this story? Was Charlotte justified in killing her mother, or helping her mother die? Was Elijah responsible for manipulating two traumatized women, or was he just surviving the only way he could? And what about Victoria? Was she the villain of this story, or just another casualty of a system that destroyed everyone it touched, turning victims into abusers in an unbreakable chain? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story disturbing, important, or both, subscribe to the channel for more dark historical tales that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and the cycles of violence that societies create. This is what happens when violence becomes normalized, when suffering is hidden behind respectability, when people are forced to become monsters just to survive. The plantation system didn't just enslave bodies, it enslaved souls. It twisted psychology beyond recognition. It turned victims into perpetrators and love into possession, and survival into a game where everyone loses, every single time, without exception. The Ashmore Fairfax family continued for generations in Charleston. They had wealth, status, respectability, but they also had a darkness at their core that never went away, that couldn't be washed out no matter how much money or time passed. Victoria's journal, once discovered, couldn't be forgotten. The truth, once spoken, couldn't be unspoken. The lies, once exposed, contaminated everything they'd ever touched. The journal now sits in the Charleston Historical Society archives. Researchers who read it describe experiencing nightmares, psychological distress, and a profound sense of horror at what human beings are capable of doing to one another when systems of power convince them that cruelty can be justified, that some people matter less than others, that survival requires the abandonment of humanity itself. Remember this: the most dangerous prisons are built not from stone and iron, but from secrets and shame, and the lies we tell ourselves to survive. And sometimes the price of survival is becoming someone you never wanted to be. Someone you'd have despised if you'd met them before you became them. The cellar at Magnolia Heights still exists. The current owners, distant relatives of the Fairfax family who bought the property in the 1950s, sealed it up. Nobody goes down there now. But sometimes, late at night, people who live there swear they hear sounds coming from beneath the floorboards, chains rattling, voices whispering, the ghosts of 3 people who destroyed each other so completely that even death couldn't untangle them. Until next time, remember that history's darkest chapters often remain hidden, not because they're not documented, but because those who could reveal them choose silence over truth. And because the monsters in these stories rarely look like monsters at all. They look like victims, like survivors, like people making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Like you, like me, like anyone.